He wasn't just saving souls, he was saving lives. Families ripped open envelopes and froze at a single word. Paid. Gasps, sobs, and prayers filled the church as the weight of debt vanished in an instant. This is the Empathy Room, where every story reminds us of the power of kindness. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. His name was Pastor James, and while hundreds were freed, he carried a debt he could not escape. The shock didn't end inside those church walls. Across town, families who had never set foot in his congregation opened their mail to find debts erased. Medical bills they thought would follow them for life now stamped with freedom. Local news picked up the story, calling it a modern-day miracle, and cameras soon crowded outside Pastor James' modest church. Reporters wanted answers, neighbors wanted to shake his hand, and strangers lined up at the door just to glimpse the man who had made hope tangible. Parents who had pawned wedding rings to pay for prescriptions said they could finally sleep, and one veteran told him he no longer felt like a burden to his children. It was generosity on a scale few had ever witnessed, and the world saw him as a hero. But as the applause grew louder, so did the silence he carried within himself. What the world didn't know was that Pastor James had been making payments of his own long before anyone ever heard his name. Every month, after counseling couples and praying with the sick, he would sit at a small wooden desk and write checks that barely chipped away at a mountain of debt left behind from his wife's battle with cancer. The very disease he had prayed over in others' lives had drained his savings and forced him to borrow far beyond his means, leaving him with bills that came in thick envelopes he dreaded to open. His wife had passed 5 years earlier, but the debt stayed, a constant reminder of love and loss tied to numbers he could never seem to erase. He hid it well, never missing a sermon, never letting his congregation see the weight pressing down on him each night. When he stood on Sundays, his voice was steady, but in the quiet moments, his hands trembled as he calculated what little remained after each payment. The man who freed strangers from their financial chains was still shackled to his own, and the gap between what people saw and what he lived grew wider by the day. The irony was sharp. His generosity wasn't powered by endless wealth, but by choices that stretched him thin. He drove a 20-year-old car that coughed on cold mornings, skipped vacations, and wore the same faded suits week after week. What little money came in from the church was poured into keeping lights on and families fed. While his own bills piled high in a drawer he rarely opened before midnight. When people called him selfless, he nodded politely, though he knew the truth was far messier. He was giving away what he barely had himself. At community events, he encouraged others to trust in God's provision, while his own faith was tested each time collectors left voicemails he couldn't return. Nights were the hardest, when the cheers faded and only the scratching of his pen against another payment slip filled the room. The cost of kindness was invisible to everyone but him, and though he bore it quietly, the pressure was becoming too heavy to ignore. It was during a town hall meeting, packed with families whose lives he had changed, that the weight finally began to show. Standing at the podium, Pastor James spoke about hope, but his voice cracked when he mentioned the burdens so many carried alone. A hush fell as he paused longer than usual, gripping the edges of the lectern as if to steady himself. The people before him believed he was untouchable, yet in that silence they saw a man who looked suddenly fragile. He swallowed hard, then admitted he knew what it was like to face bills that didn't stop coming, to lose sleep wondering which one to pay first. For the first time, his story bled into theirs, and whispers rippled through the crowd as heads nodded in recognition. Though he didn't reveal everything that night, the truth was slipping closer to the surface, and the secret he had carried for years was no longer fully his alone. The moment of release came one quiet Sunday evening after most of the congregation had gone home. A few church members lingered in the pews when Pastor James finally sat down, exhaling as though he had carried the weight of the world for too long. With trembling hands, he shared what he had hidden: the years of medical debt from his late wife's illness, the collector's letters that never stopped, the nights when he prayed for strength just to keep going. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the man they thought was only a giver, never a struggler. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others wiped away tears as they realized their pastor was living the same battle he had fought to end for them. Then, slowly, people began to rise to their feet, moving toward him, offering hands, words, and embraces. The man who had lifted countless burdens was no longer carrying his alone, and for the first time in years, his shoulders seemed lighter. News of his confession spread quickly, and the same community he had once lifted now turned their love back toward him. Donations came in quietly at first. Bills slipped into offering plates, anonymous checks arriving in the mail, neighbors bringing meals to his door. Soon, what had felt like an endless mountain began to shrink, not because he asked, but because those he had helped refused to let him stand alone. Pastor James stood at the pulpit weeks later with tears running freely, telling his congregation that freedom is never meant to be carried in one direction. The man who once carried shame now stood unburdened, his honesty becoming the very thing that set him free. The church erupted in applause, not for the miracle of erased debt, but for the reminder that strength is found in shared weakness. His story no longer belonged to him. It was proof that kindness always comes full circle. Pastor James set out to erase the debts of strangers, never expecting that his greatest gift would be found in revealing his own. What began as an act of generosity became a story of honesty, healing, and a community rising together. He proved that kindness is powerful, but vulnerability is what binds people closer than miracles ever could. And in the end, the man who lifted countless burdens finally learned what it meant to be lifted himself.